The stars above Varith Prime had always been gentle, soft like the bioluminescent glow of its people. But tonight they burned with the wrong kind of light. Liara Kess pressed her fingers against the cold viewport of the refugee ship, and watched her world die below her, not with silence and not with peace, but with fire and screaming and the horrible wet crunch of a civilization being swallowed whole by something that did not care what it consumed. She was an ambassador, a voice for her people among the stars, trained in diplomacy and empathy, and the art of finding common ground between species that had nothing in common at all. But none of that training had prepared her for this. None of it had prepared her for the sight of the great singing halls collapsing into rubble, while Thravani bioships circled overhead like vultures made of bone and metal. The Varoth were not warriors. They had never been warriors. They were healers and poets and musicians who could feel the emotions of other beings like ripples in still water, and that gift had made them beloved across the galaxy. But it had also left them utterly defenseless when the hegemony came. "Ambassador," a trembling voice said behind her, and she turned to see young Kale, barely old enough to have earned his glow marks, standing in the doorway with tears streaming down his luminous cheeks. "The last evacuation shuttle has docked. We have 4,000 aboard, but the ship was built for 800. Liara closed her eyes and breathed. She could feel the terror of every soul on this vessel pressing against her mind like a wave of ice water. 4,000 hearts beating too fast. 4,000 minds screaming the same question. Why is no one helping us? Because the Galactic Concord, that grand alliance of 42 spacefaring species, was doing what it always did when true danger arrived. It argued. She had watched the emergency session from this very ship. Holographic projections of ambassadors from a dozen worlds shouting over each other, while the Thravani hegemony devoured system after system. The Calvori wanted to fortify their borders and abandon the outer colonies. The Drenai wanted to negotiate, even though every species that had tried to negotiate with the Thravani had been absorbed into the hive. The Morath suggested surrender and integration, as if being consumed by a biomechanical collective was just another form of cultural exchange. Nobody suggested fighting, because nobody could win. The Thravani were not a species in any way the galaxy understood that word. They were a hunger given form, a hive mind of billions of drones wrapped in living metal, and driven by a single overmind whose only desire was to grow, to consume, to become everything. Their bioships healed themselves in battle, their drones adapted to weapons after a single exposure, and their numbers were beyond counting, because every world they took became raw material for more drones. 7 systems had fallen in 3 weeks. Varith Prime was the 8th. Liara walked through the corridors of the overcrowded ship and felt the misery around her like a physical weight. Children cried against their parents. Elders sat in stunned silence with their glow dimming, a sign of deep despair among her people. And everywhere she looked, she saw the same hollow expression, the face of someone who had just realized that the universe did not care whether they lived or died. She made her way to the communications room, a cramped space barely large enough for 2 people, and sat down at the console. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear, perhaps clearer than it had ever been, because desperation has a way of burning away everything that does not matter, and leaving only the one thing that does. She was going to do something forbidden. 300 years ago, the Galactic Concord had sealed away an entire region of space. Sector 0, they called it, though its real name was the Sol system, and within it lived a species that the galaxy had decided was too dangerous to exist alongside everyone else: humanity. Liara had studied the old records, the ones that most species preferred to forget, the ones locked behind security clearances and buried under centuries of deliberate silence. And what she had found there had fascinated and terrified her in equal measure. Humans were impossible. That was the only word that fit. They had entered the galactic stage as a young species, barely capable of faster-than-light travel, and within a single generation, they had turned everything upside down. They reverse-engineered alien technology in months that other species had taken centuries to develop. They formed alliances with enemies. They waged wars with a creativity that made military strategists weep. And they did all of it with a fire in their eyes that no other species could explain or replicate. The galaxy had not hated them. The galaxy had feared them, because humans could not be predicted, could not be modeled, could not be controlled. And the one thing that every civilization in the Concord valued above all else was control. So they built the Soul Barrier, a vast energy field spanning light years, and they locked humanity inside it, and they told themselves it was for the best. And over 3 centuries humans became a myth, then a legend, then a ghost story that officers whispered to frighten new recruits. Behave yourself, or the humans will come. Liara's fingers moved across the console, and she accessed a frequency that had been blacklisted for 300 years, a deep space communication channel aimed directly at Sector 0. And every alarm in the system screamed at her to stop. Every protocol she had ever learned told her this was madness, and she did not care. She thought of the children crying in the corridors behind her. She thought of the singing halls burning. She thought of the Concord sitting in its grand chamber, debating procedure, while worlds died. And she opened the channel. Her voice was small and raw, and it cracked on every other word, but she did not stop. She spoke in Galactic Common, the old dialect, the one humans might still remember, and she said the only thing she could think to say. "We are dying. Please, if anyone hears this, help us." The message flew into the void at the speed of light, and then faster, as the old amplifiers caught it and flung it deeper and deeper into the quarantined dark of Sector 0. Liara sat in the silence that followed, and felt foolish, felt desperate, felt like a child calling out in a dark room, hoping that something kind would answer, instead of something terrible. The console remained dark. 1 minute passed, then 5, then 10. Kale appeared in the doorway again, and opened his mouth to speak, but Liara raised a hand, and he went quiet. 15 minutes, 20. The console flickered. A single ping, sharp and clear, cut through the static like a blade through silk, and text appeared on the screen in crude and outdated Galactic Common. Just one word, just 7 letters. But Liara read them, and for the first time in days, she felt something other than despair. The word was coming. She stared at it, and she did not know whether to laugh or cry, so she did both. And beside her, young Kale read the word over her shoulder and whispered, "Who answered?" And Liara wiped her eyes and said a word that had not been spoken aloud in the halls of the Concord for 300 years. Humans. And somewhere, deep in the sealed darkness of Sector 0, something ancient and patient and terrible in its compassion began to move. The news spread through the Galactic Concord like a disease. Not slowly and not gently, but with the kind of violent speed that only true panic can produce. Ambassador Liara Cass of the Vereth people had broken the oldest law in the Concord. She had opened a channel to Sector 0. She had contacted the humans, and something on the other side had answered. Within hours, the Concord Assembly erupted into a chaos that made the Thravani invasion look like a minor inconvenience by comparison. "She has doomed us all," roared Speaker Dreth of the Calvori, his massive reptilian frame trembling not with rage, but with something far more primal. His scales had gone pale, which among his people was the unmistakable sign of deep and genuine terror. "The Thravani will consume our worlds, but the humans will do something worse." "What could possibly be worse than extinction?" Liara asked from the center of the chamber, her voice quiet. Bioluminescent skin, flickering with a cool blue that her people associated with resolve. You do not know what they are, Dreth hissed. You have read files and records and old data entries, but you do not know. You were not there. Your species was not yet part of the Concord when humanity walked among us, and I was a young officer, and I remember what they were and what they did. And I tell you now that you have opened a door that cannot be closed. Liara stood her ground and said, Then tell everyone, because right now the only thing I know is that every species in this room has a fleet and none of you will fight. So I called the one species that might. Contact. They learned too fast. That was the first problem. The Concord had developed a careful system of technology sharing, where advanced species would slowly introduce new concepts to younger civilizations, over centuries of guided development. Humans took one look at this system and ignored it completely. They got their hands on a single Drenai faster-than-light drive, and within 18 months they had not only reverse-engineered it, but improved it. They made it 30% more efficient, and they did it in a garage on one of their colony worlds, using equipment that the Drenai considered primitive. They made friends too easily. That was the second problem. Species that had been locked in cold wars for generations suddenly found themselves sitting at the same table, because some grinning human diplomat had invited them both to something called a barbecue. Humans did not understand the concept of ancient grudges, or rather, they understood it perfectly and simply refused to respect it. They believed that any two beings could find common ground if they just sat down and talked long enough. And the infuriating thing was that they were usually right. But it was the way they fought that truly terrified the galaxy. Humans did not fight like other species. Other species fought with doctrine and calculation and acceptable losses. Humans fought like every battle was personal, like every life at stake was someone they loved. They were reckless and unpredictable, and they used tactics that no military academy in the galaxy would have approved, because those tactics were insane. And yet somehow, they worked. Dreth paused in his telling, and his old eyes grew distant with memory. There was an incident, he said. We called it the Kessara Affair, and it was the reason we built the barrier. The Kessara system had been home to a species called the Velith, small and fragile and completely harmless. Member state called the Tarun Dominion and forced into labor camps. It was technically legal under Concord law, because the Velith had not yet achieved spaceflight status, and were therefore classified as a pre-contact species. The rules allowed it, the paperwork was in order, and the galaxy looked the other way. Except the humans. A human Black Ops fleet of 11 ships, commanded by a woman named Captain Elena Vasquez, jumped into the Kessara system without warning, and without authorization, and without any legal right to be there. And they told the Tarun Dominion to release the Velith or face the consequences. The Tarun laughed. They had 400 warships in the system, a full peacekeeping armada backed by Concord authority. 11 human ships against 400 was not a battle, it was a joke. The battle lasted 9 hours. When it was over, the Tarun armada was scattered and broken, and the Velith labor camps were empty, because the humans had loaded every single captive onto their ships, while simultaneously fighting a fleet 40 times their size. It should not have been possible. Every tactical model said it was impossible. But humans had a relationship with the word impossible that could only be described as hostile. Captain Vasquez broadcast an open message when it was done. Just one sentence, and it became the most feared words in the history of the Concord. We do not care about your laws, we care about people. The galaxy panicked. It was not that humanity was evil, Dreth explained carefully. It was that humanity was uncontrollable. They operated on a moral framework that existed entirely outside the systems the galaxy had built. They decided for themselves what was right and what was wrong, and then they acted on that decision with a terrifying and absolute commitment, regardless of what any law or treaty or alliance said. They were chaos, Dreth said. Beautiful and righteous chaos, but chaos all the same. and the Concord cannot function with chaos. So the vote was held, unanimous across all 42 species, and the soul barrier was erected, a wall of energy vast enough to seal an entire star system away from the rest of the galaxy. And humanity was locked inside, and the Concord told itself that it was the right thing to do, that it was for the safety of all civilized species. And over the centuries, humans faded from memory and became a warning, a bedtime story, a myth whispered to frighten those who stepped out of line. Liara listened to all of this, and when Dreth was finished, she looked around the chamber at the faces of 42 species, and she felt something that her empathic gift made painfully clear to her. They were not angry at what she had done. They were ashamed. Ashamed because they had locked away the only species that had ever fought for someone other than themselves. Ashamed because they had built a civilization on rules and order and protocol. And when the moment came that required something more than rules, they had nothing. You sealed them away because they saved people without permission, Liara said, and her voice carried through the silent chamber like a bell. You punished them for having a conscience, and now the Threvani are eating the galaxy alive, and every single one of you is sitting in this room talking about procedure while billions die. So yes, I called the humans, and I would do it again, and if that makes me a criminal, then put me in a cell, but do it quickly because we are running out of time. No one moved to arrest her. No one said a word. And far away, at the edge of Sector 0, the Sol barrier that had stood for 300 years began to tremble. The first sign came from a Concord listening post on the edge of Sector 0, a small forgotten station crewed by 3 bored Draenei technicians, who had spent the last decade monitoring a wall of energy that had never once changed in 300 years. It changed now. Senior Technician Hallett was drinking his evening nutrient broth when every alarm on the station screamed to life at once, and the readings on his console did something that should not have been possible. They spiked so hard that the display cracked down the middle. "What is happening?" his partner Yivri shouted from across the room, her 4 arms working frantically across backup systems that were also failing. Hallett stared at the data streaming across his remaining screens, and his blood went cold. The Sol barrier was shaking, not flickering or fluctuating the way energy fields sometimes did during solar storms, but shaking, vibrating, as if something enormous on the other side was pushing against it with a force that defied measurement. "Something is hitting the barrier from inside," he whispered. "That is impossible," Yivri said. "The barrier was designed to withstand anything short of a supernova." "Then you come look at these readings and tell me what you call this." She looked, and she did not have a word for it. Within the hour, every sensor array in the region was screaming the same impossible data to Concord Command. The Sol barrier was failing, not from age, not from malfunction, but because something on the other side was tearing it apart with raw brute force engineering on a scale that the galaxy had never seen. The Concord sent a scout fleet of 50 ships to observe from a safe distance, and what those ships witnessed would become the most viewed recording in galactic history. The Sol barrier was enormous. It stretched across light years of space, a shimmering curtain of energy so vast that it made stars look like sparks by comparison. It had been built by the combined effort of all 42 Concord species working together for a decade. It was the single greatest engineering project in the history of civilization, designed to stand for 10,000 years. It fell in 6 hours. The humans did not use weapons against it. They used machines, enormous construction vessels that pressed against the barrier's surface like fingers prying open a sealed door. And behind them came ships carrying devices that the Concord's best scientists could not identify. Devices that seemed to eat the barrier's energy and convert it into something else. And the whole operation moved with a coordination and precision that spoke of planning, of preparation, of a species that had been getting ready for this moment for a very long time. When the barrier finally shattered, it did not explode or collapse. It dissolved, like morning frost under a sun, and through the gap where the wall had been, came something that made every officer on every Concorde ship forget how to breathe. It was not a fleet, it was an armada. Thousands of ships poured through the opening, in formations so tight they looked like living things. And they were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Sleek carriers that moved like predatory fish through deep water. Massive dreadnoughts bristling with weapons that pulsed with a light the galaxy had never seen. Nimble wolfpack frigates that darted between the larger vessels like guard dogs around a herd. Mobile shipyards that were still building new ships even as they flew. And hospital ships, enormous gentle things the size of small moons, with hulls painted white and marked with a red cross symbol that meant nothing to the Concorde, but everything to the species that had created it. Humanity had not wasted its 300 years behind the barrier. They had built, they had prepared, they had trained and planned, and waited with the kind of patient fury that only a species with a long memory and a longer grudge could maintain. Not a grudge against the galaxy that had locked them away, but a grudge against the very concept of a universe where someone could cry for help and nobody would come. At the front of the Armada flew the flagship, the UHS Defiance, and it was a ship that broke the mind trying to comprehend its scale. It was so large that it had its own gravitational pull. Smaller ships orbited it the way moons orbit a planet, and its hull was covered in writing. Names, millions of names, etched into the metal in every human language. The names of every person humanity had lost while sealed behind the barrier, carried into battle so they would not be forgotten. On the bridge of the Defiance stood Fleet Admiral Rena Castillo. She was in her 60s, a woman with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a tight knot, and eyes that held the peculiar calm of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for a moment she hoped would never come. She wore a simple uniform without decoration or medal, because she believed that rank was a responsibility and not a reward. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet and steady in a way that made everyone around her feel like the universe was slightly less terrifying than it had been a moment before. The Concorde scout fleet hung in space and did not move, their commanders too stunned and too afraid to do anything but watch. Admiral Castillo opened a communication channel, and her face appeared on every Concorde screen in the region, and she smiled. Not the cold smile of a conqueror, not the sharp smile of someone who has come to settle a score, but the warm and weary smile of a neighbor who has heard screaming through the wall and has come to help. "This is Fleet Admiral Rena Castillo of the United Human Systems," she said. "We received a distress call. We are here to answer it. Please direct us to your refugees and to whoever is in charge. Have medical supplies, food, water, and shelter materials for approximately 40 million people, and we can have more within the week." She paused, and then added with that same gentle smile, "Also, we brought guns. Quite a lot of guns, actually. We heard you have a pest problem." The Concorde did not know what to say. Somewhere on a refugee ship, crowded with 4,000 displaced Verith, Liara Kess watched the broadcast and pressed her hand against the screen and wept. Not from fear, not from sorrow, but from a feeling so overwhelming that her empathic senses could barely contain it. The feeling of being heard, of being answered, of learning that somewhere in the vast, indifferent dark of the universe there existed a species that heard a stranger cry and said, "Yes, we will come. Tell us where it hurts." Admiral Castillo requested a meeting with the Concorde leadership and with the ambassador who had sent the distress call. She wanted to understand the enemy, wanted to see the damage. She wanted to look Liara in the eyes and tell her what she told every frightened person she had ever met in her long career. You are not alone anymore. And deep in the conquered systems of the Orion Cygnus corridor, the Thravani Overmind processed the sensor data from the barrier's collapse, and ran its threat analysis algorithms against the approaching human armada. And for the first time in its ancient and hungry existence, it produced a result it had never generated before. The result had no equivalent in the Thravani cognitive framework. It was not fear exactly, and it was not caution. It was something new and cold and deeply unsettling, a concept that the Overmind would spend days trying to understand before finally translating it into the closest approximation its language allowed. The word was uncertainty. And uncertainty, for a being that had consumed 10,000 worlds without ever once doubting the outcome, was the most chilling sensation it had ever encountered. Terrifying thing in the universe. Solhari Station hung in the void like a wounded animal, surrounded by wolves. It was a massive structure, a Concord deep space outpost that had become the last refuge for nearly 2 million beings from a dozen different species, all of them running from the Thravani advance. All of them crammed into corridors and cargo bays and maintenance tunnels with barely enough air and water to last another week. And surrounding it in every direction, stretching across the black like a living wall of bone and metal, was the Thravani swarm fleet. 10,000 bioships, each one a nightmare of organic technology, hulls that breathed and healed and grew new weapons as fast as old ones were destroyed. Crewed by drones that felt no pain and no fear and no mercy, because the Overmind that controlled them had no use for such things. The Concorde had sent no rescue fleet because there was no rescue fleet to send. Every major navy had pulled back to defend their own homeworlds. Alliance was fracturing in real time, and Solhari Station had been written off as lost, just another sacrifice to buy time that nobody knew how to use. Then the humans arrived. The vanguard of the human armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. 300 ships under the command of Captain Tomas Reyes aboard the destroyer UHS Falling Star. The Concorde observers who were monitoring Solhari from a safe distance saw the human ships appear on their sensors and immediately opened a channel to warn them. Human vessels, you are outnumbered approximately 30 to 1. The swarm fleet at Solhari is the largest Thravani force we have ever recorded. We advise immediate withdrawal. Captain Reyes appeared on screen, a compact man in his 40s, with a crooked nose that had been broken at least twice, and dark eyes that held something the Concorde officers could not quite identify. It was not madness exactly, and it was not courage. Exactly, it was something in between, something uniquely human. 30 to 1, he said, and nodded slowly, so we have them right where we want them. The channel went silent. The Concorde observers watched in horrified fascination as 300 human ships accelerated directly toward 10,000 Thravani bioships, and what followed would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. Humans did not fight the way other species fought. The Concorde's military doctrine was built on mathematics, calculated positioning, optimal firing angles, acceptable casualty ratios, predictive algorithms that modeled enemy behavior and generated the statistically best response. It was clean and logical, and it had failed against the Thravani, because the Thravani hive mind was the ultimate calculator. It processed data faster than any fleet computer, and adapted to patterns within minutes. Humans had no patterns. Split his 300 ships into dozens of independent wolf packs, and gave each captain a single order. Fight your own way, protect the station, and if you see something stupid that might work, then do it. He called it the doctrine of creative violence, and it was the single most terrifying military strategy the galaxy had ever encountered, because it was not really a strategy at all. It was organized chaos. It was 300 captains, each making their own decisions in real time based on instinct and experience and something humans called gut feeling. The Thravani swarm mind tried to adapt, and it could not. Every time it identified a pattern in one group of human ships, another group did something completely different. One wolf pack charged directly into the thickest part of the swarm and detonated electromagnetic pulse charges at point-blank range, frying the neural links between drones. Another group hung back and picked off bioships with precision strikes from extreme range. A third wolf pack did something that the Threvani literally could not process. They flew their ships into the gaps between bioships and used grappling systems to physically drag enemy vessels into each other. Human fighter pilots launched from carrier bays and flew into the swarm like insects attacking a beast 1,000 times their size. Except these insects carried weapons that burned through living hull metal like acid through paper. And when their weapons ran dry, some of them rammed their fighters into critical systems and ejected at the last second, tumbling through the void in nothing but flight suits, laughing and screaming, and somehow still fighting. Marine boarding parties breached the largest bioships using cutting charges and entered on foot with flamethrowers and kinetic weapons, and the kind of close-quarters fury that the galaxy had only ever read about in ancient texts about species long extinct. The drones inside those ships outnumbered the Marines 10-1, but it did not matter, because humans fought like every corridor was the last stand of their civilization. They fought with a rage that was not mindless, but focused, not cruel, but absolute. 6 hours after the battle began, it was over. The swarm fleet was broken, scattered into fragments that tumbled away into the dark. 2/3 of the bioships were destroyed, and the rest were crippled beyond recovery. Solhari Station was intact. 2 million refugees were alive, and the human fleet had lost 47 ships and 1,216 people. Captain Reyes ordered the names of every fallen human recorded on the hull of his ship before he did anything else. And then something happened that shocked the galaxy more than the battle itself. The human hospital ships moved in. They came forward through the debris field like white ghosts, enormous and gentle, and they opened their bays and launched thousands of medical shuttles that spread across the battlefield in every direction, and they began to help. They helped the Concord species first. The refugees on Solhari Station received food and water and medicine within the hour. Human doctors and nurses flooded the station and set up emergency clinics in cargo bays and corridors. They treated injuries and infections and the deep psychological wounds of people who had been running for weeks with no hope. But they did not stop there. The human medics also collected Threvani drones from the wreckage of destroyed bioships. Living drones, wounded and confused and severed from the Overmind's control for the first time in their existence. And instead of killing them or imprisoning them, the humans brought them aboard the hospital ships and treated their wounds. A Concord observer recorded footage that would become the most watched video in galactic history. A human nurse, a young woman with tired eyes and steady hands, sitting beside a Threvani drone, was twice her size, its biomechanical limbs twitching with confusion and fear because it had never had its own thoughts before, and the experience was overwhelming. And the nurse held its claw, held the claw of a creature whose species had murdered billions, and spoke to it softly, telling it that it was safe, that no one was going to hurt it, that everything was going to be okay. The drone did not understand her words, but it understood her tone, and it stopped trembling. Across the galaxy, beings of every species watched this footage and did not know what to feel. The humans had just fought with a savagery that made the Threvani look restrained by comparison, and now they were holding the hands of their enemies and telling them it would be all right. Admiral Castillo broadcast a message to the entire Concord from the bridge of the Defiance, and her voice was calm and warm and carried the quiet weight of absolute certainty. "We will fight your war," she said. "We will. Break your enemy, and when it is done, we will heal what we can, even them. This is not a negotiation. This is not a transaction. This is who we are. We are the species that fights with everything we have and then picks up the wounded on both sides. You locked us away because that frightened you, and I understand. We frighten ourselves sometimes, but you called for help, and we are here, and we are not leaving until this is over. In the conquered systems, the Threvani Overmind analyzed the battle data from Salhari and ran its projections, and for the second time in its existence, it encountered a result it could not process. It was not the human weapons that disturbed it. Those could be adapted to. It was not the human tactics, because tactics could eventually be modeled. It was the fact that the humans had shown mercy to captured drones. The Overmind had consumed 10,000 civilizations, and not one of them had ever shown mercy to a Threvani drone. Ever looked at the enemy and seen something worth saving. And the Overmind could not calculate what kind of species would do that, could not model the behavior, could not predict what such a species would do next. And for a being that had always known exactly what would happen next, that was the most dangerous thing it had ever encountered. The word the Overmind finally settled on was one it had to invent for itself, because it had never needed it before. The word was dread. The war lasted 6 months, and it ended not with a single great battle, but with a silence that spread across the galaxy, like the first warm day after an endless winter. Humanity did not destroy the Threvani. They did something far more devastating. They took the Overmind apart piece by piece, not by killing it, but by disconnecting it. Human cyber warfare teams identified the neural relay nodes that allowed the Overmind to control its billions of drones, and they severed them one by one with surgical precision, cutting the strings of the puppet master while their fleets held the line against wave after wave of increasingly desperate counterattacks. Each time a relay node fell, another region of space went quiet, as millions of drones suddenly found themselves alone in their own heads for the first time in their existence. Some panicked, some shut down, some simply stopped and stood still, as their minds struggled to process the terrifying and beautiful experience of having their own thoughts. And every time, the human hospital ships were there. They were always there, right behind the warships, moving in the moment the fighting stopped. Teams of doctors and psychologists and counselors flooding into liberated zones to help not just the freed Concord species, but the Threvani drones themselves. Because humanity had looked at these creatures that the galaxy saw as monsters, and recognized something that no other species had been willing to see. The drones were victims too. The Overmind did not go quietly. In its final days, it concentrated everything it had left into a last desperate push, pulling its remaining forces into the Vareth system, Liara's home system, the place where this had all begun. And it fortified Vareth Prime, and surrounded itself with the largest concentration of bioships it could still command, daring humanity to come and finish what they had started. Admiral Castillo came. The Battle of Vareth Prime was the Battle of Vareth Prime, last major engagement of the war, and it was fought with a ferocity that would have destroyed a lesser species on both sides. The Overmind threw everything it had at the human fleet. Wave after wave of drones and bioships and orbital defense platforms, grown from the consumed remains of the world below. And the humans met every wave with that same impossible combination of fury and precision that had defined their entire campaign. Liara watched from the bridge of a Concord observation vessel as the sky above her dead world burned with the light of 10,000 explosions. Human ships diving through fields of fire that would have stopped any other fleet, their pilots making decisions in fractions of seconds that the Overmind's vast intelligence could not anticipate, dying and fighting and dying some more, and never once stopping, never once retreating, never once considering the possibility that they might lose. Because humans did not consider that possibility, it simply did not exist in their thinking. Not because they were foolish, but because they had decided that losing was not acceptable when innocent lives were at stake. And once a human decided something was not acceptable, they would burn the universe down before they allowed it to happen. The Overmind's final relay node was aboard a massive command bioship, hidden deep in the wreckage of Verith Prime's largest city. Captain Reyes led the assault personally, taking his wolf pack through the atmosphere and into the ruins, dodging anti-aircraft fire from living turrets that grew out of the rubble like terrible flowers. And when his ships could go no further, he landed and went on foot with a platoon of Marines through streets that had once been filled with music and light, and were now corridors of bone and metal. They found the relay node in what had been the Great Singing Hall, the most sacred place on Verith Prime, and Reyes paused for just a moment in the doorway and looked at the ruin of that beautiful place, and something hard and cold settled in his eyes. "Cut it," he said. The engineers severed the node, and across the galaxy the last connection snapped. And the Overmind, that ancient and hungry intelligence that had consumed 10,000 worlds, found itself alone. Just a mind without hands, a voice without a mouth, thinking its last thoughts in a silence it had never known. The war was over. What followed was the hardest part. Not the fighting, not the dying, but the slow and painful work of putting a galaxy back together. Humanity threw itself into reconstruction with the same overwhelming energy it had brought to the war. Shipyards that had been building warships switched to building colony modules and atmospheric processors and water purification systems. Soldiers who had stormed bioships with flamethrowers now carried building materials and medical supplies into devastated communities. The same captains who had led wolf packs through impossible battles now commanded convoys of relief ships carrying food to worlds that had been starving for months. The freed Thravani drones were the most complicated problem. There were billions of them scattered across hundreds of worlds, newly conscious beings with no culture, no language, no understanding of themselves as individuals. They were frightened and confused, and the galaxy wanted to hate them for what the Overmind had made them do. Humanity refused to let that happen. Human rehabilitation centers opened on dozens of worlds, staffed by volunteers who had lost friends and family to the Thravani, and who chose to help anyway, because that was who they were. Psychologists worked with drones who were learning to think for themselves. Teachers taught them language and communication. Counselors helped them process the trauma of remembering what the Overmind had forced them to do. And slowly, painfully, a new Thravani culture began to emerge. One built not on hunger, but on the desperate, grateful wonder of beings who had been freed from slavery they had not even known they were in. The Galactic Concord held a formal assembly 6 months after the war's end, and they invited humanity to attend for the first time in 300 years. The chamber was full, representatives of all 42 species, plus delegations from a dozen newly liberated worlds, and at the center stood Admiral Rena Castillo in her simple uniform, without medals or decorations, looking every bit as calm and steady as she had on the day she broke through the barrier. Speaker Dreth rose first, the old Calvori, who had been so afraid when he learned what Liara had done, and his voice was thick with emotion that his species rarely showed. 300 years ago this body voted to seal your people away, because we feared what you were, he said. I voted for that measure, I believed it was right, and I stand before you now as a fool who mistook his own. Cowardice for wisdom. We owe you a debt that cannot be measured, and an apology that cannot be adequate. Castillo listened and nodded, and when it was her turn to speak, she looked around the chamber slowly, meeting the eyes of every species, every ambassador, every frightened and grateful face. 300 years ago, you locked us away because we scared you, she said. And I understand why. We scare ourselves sometimes. We are loud and reckless, and we feel things so deeply that it makes us do things that look like madness from the outside. But here is what you never understood about us. She paused, and the chamber held its breath. We are not dangerous because we are strong. We are dangerous because we care. Because when someone cries for help, we cannot look away. We are not built that way. It is not in us. You built a wall to keep out monsters, but all you really locked away were the only people in this galaxy who would have come running the moment you needed us." Screamed. In the gallery above, Liara Kess watched and listened, and felt something wash over her that was so vast and warm that her bioluminescent skin blazed with light. Her people had a word for it: Vetani, the overwhelming warmth of being truly seen by someone who chose to help not because they had to, but because they could not bear not to. She wept, and her tears glowed like tiny stars. The Concord voted unanimously to dissolve the soul barrier permanently and to welcome humanity back into the galactic community. Not as a junior member, not as a controlled asset, but as equals, as allies, as the neighbors they should have embraced 300 years ago. And in a small rehabilitation center, on a reclaimed station at the edge of what had once been Thravani space, a moment occurred that nobody important witnessed and no historian recorded, but that mattered more than all the speeches and all the votes and all the grand gestures combined. Thravani drone, designated 11 Kree, sat at a small table in a room painted in soft warm colors. It had been free for 4 months now, and it was still learning what that meant. Still discovering that it had preferences and feelings and thoughts that belonged to no one but itself. Beside it sat a human child, a girl of perhaps 7 years old, the daughter of a Marine who had volunteered at the center. And she had brought crayons, bright-colored sticks of wax that she used to make marks on paper that represented things. She called it drawing. She pushed a crayon toward 11 Kree and said, "Here, you try." The drone picked up the crayon with clumsy biomechanical fingers that had been designed for violence and had never before been asked to create anything. And it pressed the crayon to the paper, and it drew a circle, and inside the circle it drew lines radiating outward. And it did not know why it had drawn this shape, but something about it felt right, felt warm, felt like the opposite of everything the Overmind had ever made it feel. The girl looked at the drawing and smiled a smile so bright and genuine that 11 Kree felt something crack open inside its chest. Something new and frightening and wonderful. "That is a son," the girl said. "That is really good." The drone did not know the word for what it was feeling. It had been alive as an individual for only 4 months, and its emotional vocabulary was still the size of a small puddle. But it felt it. It felt it like warmth, like light, like the opposite of hunger, and it carefully picked up another crayon and began to draw again. And that was the day the galaxy learned the truth about humanity. They were not the most powerful species. They were not the most advanced. They were not the most ancient or the most wise. They were simply the ones who showed up, and they refused to leave until everyone was safe.